In the floating academies above the Stormreach Mountains, where clouds kissed metal spires and dragons soared between training platforms, there existed an unspoken rule: some creatures were born blessed and others were born cursed. The cadets whispered it in dormitories, instructors acknowledged it with silent nods, and the dragons themselves seemed to understand this cruel hierarchy. At the very bottom of this invisible ladder, forgotten in the shadowed corner of the eastern creature yard, lay a dragon the color of winter frost and broken promises. Ember had not always been so small, so thin, so defeated. He remembered his hatching day 4 months ago, remembered the collective gasp when his shell cracked open to reveal scales the color of pale moonlight instead of the vibrant crimsons, deep emeralds, or royal blues that marked healthy dragonkind. The handlers had stepped back, their faces twisted with ancient superstition. Albino dragons brought misfortune, they said. Albino dragons never bonded. Albino dragons should never have been allowed to hatch at all. But the academy prided itself on progressive thinking, on breaking old prejudices, so they kept him. They fed him the minimum required by regulation. They gave him a pen with walls but no warmth. And then they forgot about him. Now, as purple twilight painted the sky beyond the energy barriers, Ember watched the evening feeding ritual with hollow eyes. Across the yard, Brennan Hawk strutted past the feeding stations with his bonded dragon, Scorcher, a magnificent crimson beast whose scales gleamed like polished rubies. Scorcher received 3 full portions of fresh meat, vitamin-enriched grain, and mineral supplements that sparkled like crushed gems. His cadet brushed his scales with devoted strokes, whispering praise and promises. Ember received a single gray nutrition block dropped into his trough by a maintenance drone that never looked his way. The block tasted like ash and disappointment, providing barely enough sustenance to keep his heart beating but nothing more. Every rib pressed against Ember's dulled white scales like prison bars. His wings, which should have been spreading wider each week, remained stunted and trembling. When he moved, his joints ached with the deep pain of malnutrition. But worse than the physical hunger was the emptiness in his chest where a bond should have been growing. Dragons were not meant to be alone. They were not meant to spend their days watching other creatures receive love while they received nothing but averted eyes and whispered curses. Still alive, ghost dragon? Brennan's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. He stood outside Ember's pen with 3 other senior cadets, all of them wearing the satisfied smirks of those who had never known real hunger or loneliness. I told Instructor Garrett he's wasting resources keeping you around. My grandfather used to say albino drakes were death omens on his homeworld. They'd cull them before they brought bad luck to the whole colony. The other cadets laughed, the sound harsh and casual. Ember kept his pale eyes fixed on the far wall, refusing to acknowledge them. He had learned this survival technique early: show nothing, feel everything, endure. Inside, though, something cracked a little deeper. He had tried, in those first weeks, to approach cadets during bonding exercises. He had tried to show them he was intelligent, capable, worthy. Each time, they had turned away with disgust or fear in their eyes. Each rejection had carved away another piece of his hope until nothing remained but the quiet determination to survive another day. Instructor Garrett appeared for evening inspections, his tall frame casting long shadows across the feeding area. He was not a cruel man, but neither was he kind. He believed in efficiency, in results, in the natural order of things. When he reached Ember's pen, he glanced at the untouched nutrition block and made a note on his data pad with mechanical disinterest. Creature continues refusing adequate nutrition, Garrett muttered to his assistant. Recommend reducing rations further. No point wasting academy resources on a failed specimen. Failed specimen. The word settled over Ember like a shroud. He was not a dragon in their eyes. He was a mistake, an embarrassment, a problem to be managed with minimal effort until nature took its course and solved the issue permanently. His tail curled tighter around his thin body as the instructor moved on without a second glance. One by one, the other cadets led their bonded creatures toward the interior halls where warm sleeping quarters, comfortable nests, and continued companionship awaited them. The crimson dragons went with heads held high. The emerald serpents coiled contentedly around their partners' shoulders. Even the smaller copper drakes received affectionate scratches behind their ear ridges as they departed. Ember watched them all disappear, leaving him alone in the growing darkness with only the hum of the barrier and the cold stone floor for company. He finally dragged himself to his feeding trough when the yard fell completely silent. The nutrition block tasted worse than usual, but he forced it down. Pride would not keep him alive, and some stubborn part of him refused to surrender completely. He had survived this long. He would survive another night, and another, until either his body gave out or something changed. He did not believe anything would change, but dragons were creatures of stubborn hope even when logic said hope was foolish. Ember had just curled into his usual sleeping position, tucking his snout beneath one trembling wing, when he heard footsteps. Light ones, hesitant, belonging to someone small. He cracked one pale eye open, expecting perhaps a maintenance worker or another cadet come to mock him in private. Instead, he found himself staring at a human child he had never seen before. She was tiny, even for human standards. Her dark hair was pulled into a practical braid that had started to come loose during the day. Her academy jumpsuit hung on her thin frame like borrowed clothes, the sleeves rolled up several times to accommodate her short arms. But it was her eyes that caught Ember's attention. They were deep brown, serious beyond her years, and looking directly at him with an expression he could not immediately identify. Not disgust. Not amusement. Not pity. Something else entirely. The girl was perhaps 11 years old, though Ember had limited experience judging human ages. She stood outside his pen, completely still, just watching him with those thoughtful eyes. He stared back, uncertain and wary. Every human who had approached his pen before had brought pain in one form or another: insults, thrown objects, cruel laughter. He waited for this child to reveal her true purpose. But she did not laugh. She did not throw anything. She did not call him names or make disgusted faces. She simply studied him with quiet intensity, taking in his thin frame, his dull scales, his trembling wings. Several long minutes passed in this strange standoff. Then, very slowly, the girl sat down on the ground outside his barrier. Not standing over him in dominance. Not maintaining distance in fear. Just sitting, as if she planned to stay a while. Ember's ear ridges lifted slightly in confusion. This was new. This was different. He uncurled just enough to get a better look at her. Up close, he could see that she was not well fed either. Her cheeks were hollow, her wrists too thin. She carried the same exhaustion in her posture that he felt in his bones. Another outsider, perhaps. Another creature the Academy had deemed insufficient. "You're hungry, aren't you?" The girl's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried across the space between them with unexpected weight. She was not asking permission to state the obvious. She was acknowledging his suffering with simple, direct honesty. Ember's tail twitched involuntarily. He could not speak human languages, could not explain that yes, he was always hungry, that hunger had become his constant companion along with loneliness and despair. But something in her tone made his throat tighten with an emotion he had almost forgotten existed. The girl stood up slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. She looked around to ensure they were alone, then turned back to Ember with an expression of quiet determination. "I'll come back," she said, and there was promise in those simple words. "I'll come back tomorrow night, and I'll bring you something better than those terrible blocks. I promise." Then she turned and walked away into the darkness, her small figure disappearing between the other pens toward the Academy buildings. Ember watched her go, his heart beating faster than it had in months. He did not know who she was. He did not know why she had come or if she would truly return. He had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. But as he settled back into his corner that night, something stirred in his chest besides the familiar ache of hunger and loneliness. It was fragile and frightened, barely alive after months of starvation. Yet it was there, undeniable and growing with each passing moment. For the first time since his hatching, Ember felt the faintest whisper of something he had thought lost forever. He felt hope. The girl's name was Reina Torres, though Ember would not learn this for several more days. She was 11 years old, the youngest cadet in the junior program by nearly 3 years, admitted early because her test scores had been exceptional even if everything else about her screamed inadequacy. She came from a mining colony on the edge of civilized space, where her parents had worked deep underground extracting rare crystals that powered the floating academies. She had grown up in cramped tunnels and recycled air, helping tend the colony's small livestock that provided food in that harsh environment. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be considered too small, too weak, too different to matter. On her second evening at the academy, during the orientation tour of the creature yards, Reina had spotted Ember huddled in his corner while the instructor droned on about proper bonding techniques. Everyone else had been mesmerized by the impressive dragons on display, the ones with gleaming scales and powerful wings. Reina had only noticed the white dragon trying to disappear into shadows, and something in her chest had recognized something in him. They were the same, she and this forgotten creature. They were both fighting to survive in a world that had already decided they did not belong. Now, 3 days after making her promise, Reina worked quietly in the cadet kitchen during the late evening hours. She had permission to be here as junior cadets were encouraged to learn basic nutrition and food preparation. What she carefully did not mention was that she was not preparing food for herself. The kitchen supervisor, Mira Oakes, was a round woman with flour-dusted hands and a kind smile who had taken pity on the lonely girl who appeared each night. She pretended not to notice when Reina measured out protein powder, grain paste, and carefully researched mineral supplements into mixing bowls. Dragons need calcium and iron, Reina muttered to herself, consulting notes she had copied from the Academy Library archives. Phosphorus for bone growth. Amino acids for scale health. Just like the mining colony livestock, but scaled up. She mixed the ingredients with practiced hands, remembering her mother's lessons about animal nutrition. The paste was thick and greenish-brown, not appealing to human senses but formulated specifically for dragon taste preferences and nutritional needs. She shaped them into small bars and baked them on low heat until they firmed up. When they cooled, she wrapped them in cloth and tucked them carefully into her jacket pockets. The walk to the creature yards felt both too long and too short. Doubt whispered in her mind with each step. What if he rejected her offering? What if someone discovered what she was doing and expelled her for wasting resources? What if she was being foolish, trying to help a creature that everyone, even the experts, had deemed beyond help? But Reina remembered the way those pale eyes had looked at her, really looked with awareness and intelligence that nobody else seemed to recognize. He was not defective. He was starving for more than just food. The yards were nearly empty at this hour. A few dedicated cadets tended their bonded creatures in distant pens, but nobody paid attention to the small girl who seemed to drift through the academy like a ghost. Reina approached Ember's pen with her heart hammering against her ribs. He was lying in his usual corner, but his head lifted the moment she came into view. Recognition flickered across his features, and something that might have been relief. "Hey," Reina said softly, kneeling outside the barrier. "I came back like I promised." Ember watched her intently, his body language cautious but not defensive. His tail remained still, his wings stayed folded, but his eyes tracked her every movement with sharp intelligence. Waiting. Evaluating. Hoping, perhaps, but afraid to hope too much. Reina pulled out one of the nutrition bars, still slightly warm from baking. "I made this for you," she said, holding it where he could see clearly. "I researched what dragons need, what your body is missing. It's not fancy like what the bonded creatures get, but it's real nutrition. Not those awful chalk blocks they give you." She knew he could not understand her words, but tone mattered. Animals responded to gentleness, to patience, to respect. She had learned this truth in the mining colony, bottle-feeding injured creatures that everyone else said should be put down. She placed the bar on the ground just inside the barrier, then backed away several steps to give him space. "You don't have to trust me yet," Reyna continued, keeping her voice steady and calm. "I know you've been hurt. I know everyone has given up on you. But I haven't. I won't. Would you try it, please?" The white dragon stared at the offering for a long moment. Then at Reyna. Then back at the food. The silence stretched between them, filled with weight and possibility. Finally, slowly, Ember uncurled his thin body and stood. He was larger than Reyna had realized, even malnourished as he was. His movements were stiff, cautious, each step deliberate. He approached the nutrition bar and sniffed it carefully, his nostrils flaring as he analyzed the scent. Then he looked at Reyna one more time, as if asking permission or perhaps offering thanks. She smiled encouragingly but remained still, giving him control of the moment. Ember took a small, tentative bite. His eyes widened immediately. He took another bite, faster this time, then another until the entire bar disappeared. When he finished, he sat back on his haunches and made a low sound deep in his chest. Not threatening. Almost like a purr of contentment. "You liked it?" Reyna whispered, delighted. "I'm so glad." The dragon tilted his head, studying her with new interest. Up close, Reyna could see that his scales had an unusual translucent quality that caught the dim light and created faint rainbow shimmer along his neck and wings. He was not ugly or cursed. He was beautiful in a completely different way than the other dragons, beautiful in the way that pearls and opals were beautiful, subtle and unexpected. "My name is Reyna," she said, knowing he would not understand but needing to introduce herself properly. "I'm new here too. I don't fit in either. Everyone thinks I'm too small, too young, too quiet. Too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. Maybe we're both the wrong shape for this place." Ember made another soft sound, and Reyna could have sworn he looked sympathetic. She settled more comfortably on the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. "I grew up in the mining tunnels on Verglas colony. It's cold there, dark most of the time. My parents work 16-hour shifts extracting crystal deposits. I used to help care for the livestock we kept for food and companionship. There was this one goat, Pepper, who had a twisted leg. Everyone said to put her down, that she'd never be productive. But I took care of her anyway, and she ended up being the best milk producer in the whole colony." She paused, looking directly into Ember's pale eyes. "Everyone was wrong about her. And I think everyone is wrong about you too." The dragon moved closer to the barrier, as close as he could get without touching the energy field. He settled into a sitting position, his attention focused completely on Reyna. For the first time in 4 months, he did not look like a creature waiting to die. He looked like a dragon listening to the most important story he had ever heard. Reyna visited every evening for the next 3 weeks. She brought nutrition bars with increasingly refined recipes, learning through trial and error which flavors Ember preferred and which supplements helped most with his recovery. She talked to him about everything: her classes where she struggled with physical combat training, her loneliness in the dormitories where other girls whispered about her strange accent and awkward manners, her memories of home and family. Ember listened to all of it, his presence becoming the one constant comfort in her difficult new life. The changes in Ember were remarkable and impossible to hide. His ribs stopped showing through his sides as muscle filled in beneath strengthening scales. Those scales developed a lustrous quality, transforming from dull gray-white to brilliant pearl that shimmered with inner light. His movements grew fluid and powerful. His wings began spreading wider during his evening stretches, no longer trembling with weakness. Even his size increased noticeably as proper nutrition unlocked the growth that starvation had stunted. He looked like a different dragon entirely, or rather, he looked like the dragon he was always meant to become. Other cadets began to notice. Whispers followed Reyna through the hallways, speculation about the mysterious transformation of the ghost dragon. Brennan Hawks was the most vocal with his suspicions. He cornered Reyna one evening near the dormitories, his friends flanking him like a pack of predators. "You've been feeding the albino," Brennan said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Don't deny it. Everyone can see he's changed, and you're the only one pathetic enough to waste time on that cursed creature." Reyna met his gaze steadily, though her heart raced with fear. "He's not cursed. He was neglected. There's a difference." "He's defective," Brennan snapped. "My grandfather knew the old ways, knew that albinos bring disaster. You're making a mistake getting attached to something that will never bond properly, that will never be anything but a burden." "Maybe your grandfather was wrong," Reyna said quietly. "Maybe a lot of the old ways were wrong." Brennan's face flushed with anger. "We'll see about that. When that creature fails its bonding assessment, when it proves what everyone already knows, you'll look like the fool you are." He stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his size. "Stay away from it, colony girl. You're embarrassing yourself and wasting academy resources." "No," Reyna said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I won't." That night, when Reyna arrived at Ember's pen, she found Brennan there ahead of her. He had somehow accessed the barrier controls and was inside the enclosure with Scorcher, his crimson dragon. Ember was pressed against the far wall, his body language defensive but not cowering. Brennan held a shock prod, the kind used to control aggressive creatures during training. "Let's see how special your little ghost really is," Brennan taunted, advancing with the prod raised. "Stop!" Reyna shouted, rushing forward. But before Brennan could strike, Ember moved. Despite months of malnutrition and weakness, despite never receiving combat training, the white dragon's protective instinct blazed to life. He lunged forward with surprising speed, placing himself between the threat and Reyna. His wings spread wide, suddenly magnificent and powerful. His pale eyes blazed with fierce intelligence and determination. A low growl rumbled from his chest, unmistakably warning Brennan to back away. Scorcher, the supposedly superior dragon, hesitated. Something in Ember's posture, in the raw protective fury radiating from him, made the crimson dragon step backward despite being larger and better trained. Brennan's confidence faltered as he realized his bonded creature would not attack. "Get out," Reyna said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Get out now, or I'll report this to Instructor Garrett." Brennan retreated with his dragon, shooting them both a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed before disappearing into the darkness. Reyna's legs nearly gave out from the adrenaline crash. She sank to the ground, and Ember immediately moved to her side. For the first time, he deliberately pressed his side against her, offering physical comfort. His scales were warm and surprisingly soft, and Reyna could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath them. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you for protecting me." Ember made a deep, rumbling sound of contentment and leaned into her embrace. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. They were no longer just a girl and a dragon offering each other kindness. They were becoming bonded, truly bonded, in a way that transcended academy rules and ancient prejudices. They had chosen each other, and that choice was becoming something powerful and real. As Reyna held Ember in the darkness, feeling his strength and warmth, she knew their story was far from over. The real challenges were just beginning. But for now, in this perfect moment, they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The confrontation in Ember's pen did not remain secret for long. Brennan, furious at being humiliated by a creature he considered inferior and a cadet he deemed worthless, filed a formal complaint with the Academy administration. By morning, Reyna found herself summoned to Commander Thorne's office, the head administrator whose word determined the fate of every cadet and creature within the floating academy's walls. The walk to the administrative tower felt like marching toward execution. Other cadets stared as Reyna passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to schadenfreude. News traveled fast in the academy, and everyone knew the colony girl was in serious trouble for unauthorized bonding activities with the albino dragon. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked satisfied that the strange, quiet girl who had never fit in was finally going to be expelled. Commander Thorne's office occupied the highest level of the central tower, surrounded by windows that looked out over the clouds and mountains below. The commander herself was a formidable woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that had witnessed decades of cadet failures and successes. She sat behind a massive desk carved from ancient wood, flanked by Instructor Garrett and, surprisingly, Mira Oakes from the kitchen. Brennan stood to one side with his arms crossed, wearing a victorious smirk. Cadet Torres, Commander Thorne's voice was like granite, smooth but unyielding. You stand accused of multiple regulation violations. Unauthorized feeding of an unbonded creature. Misappropriation of academy resources. Interfering with scheduled creature care protocols. Most seriously, attempting to bond with a creature without proper authorization or supervision. Do you deny these charges? Reyna's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet the commander's gaze without flinching. No, ma'am. I don't deny any of it. Instructor Garrett shook his head with disappointment. The creature in question is classified as unsuitable for bonding. It was being maintained purely for observation and research purposes. Your interference has complicated months of data collection and violated our protocols. Research? Reyna's voice came out sharper than she intended. You were researching how long a dragon could survive on starvation rations. How completely a living being could be broken by neglect. Mind your tone, Cadet, Commander Thorne warned, but there was something in her eyes that was not entirely hostile. Perhaps curiosity. Brennan stepped forward eagerly. Commander, I witnessed this cadet putting herself and academy property at risk through reckless emotional attachment to a defective specimen. The albino showed aggressive behavior when I attempted to conduct a legitimate assessment of its temperament. It's dangerous and should be removed from the academy before someone gets seriously hurt. You entered his pen with a shock prod and threatened him, Reyna shot back, her fear transforming into righteous anger. Ember wasn't being aggressive. He was protecting me from you. Ember? Instructor Garrett raised an eyebrow. You've named it? Him, Reyna corrected firmly. His name is Ember, and he's not an it or a research specimen. He's intelligent and loyal and everything a bonded dragon should be. The only thing wrong with him is that everyone decided he was worthless before giving him a real chance. Commander Thorne leaned back in her chair, studying Reyna with unsettling intensity. You're 11 years old, Cadet Torres. The youngest in the program. You have no combat training, minimal field experience, and you've been here less than 2 months. What makes you think you understand dragon bonding better than instructors who have dedicated their entire lives to this field? Reyna took a deep breath, knowing her next words would determine everything. Because I don't see creatures as data points or breeding statistics or superstitious omens, ma'am. I see them as living beings who deserve basic kindness and respect. Where I come from, we couldn't afford to waste anything or anyone. Every creature had value if you were willing to look for it. Ember isn't defective. He was neglected and mistreated, and when someone finally treated him with basic decency, he thrived. That's not a failure of the dragon. That's a failure of the system. The office fell silent. Instructor Garrett looked affronted. Brennan's smirk had faded into uncertainty. Commander Thorne's expression remained unreadable. But Mira Oakes, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward with gentle determination. Commander, if I may, the kitchen supervisor said. I've watched this child come to my kitchen every evening for 3 weeks. She researched dragon nutrition in the library, calculated precise supplement ratios, and prepared food with more care than most cadets show their already bonded creatures. She didn't do it for recognition or advancement. She did it because she saw suffering and couldn't walk away. That speaks to character that cannot be taught. The regulations exist for good reasons, Instructor Garrett argued. Unsupervised bonding can result in dangerous attachments, inadequate training, and creatures that become liabilities rather than assets. We cannot simply ignore protocol because a cadet has good intentions. Then perhaps our protocols need examination, Commander Thorne said quietly. All eyes turned to her in surprise. She stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the academy grounds. Brennan, you filed this complaint claiming the albino dragon is dangerous. Yet your own report states that your bonded dragon, Scorcher, refused to engage when challenged. Why would a superior, well-trained creature back down from a supposedly defective opponent? Brennan stammered, Scorcher was simply being cautious, ma'am. Strategic assessment of. Or perhaps Scorcher recognized something you didn't, the commander interrupted. Perhaps he sensed a true bond forming, something authentic enough to make him respected even when you commanded otherwise. She turned back to face the room. I've been administering this academy for 32 years. In that time, I've seen hundreds of bonds form between cadets and creatures. Most are adequate. Some are exceptional. But very few show the kind of loyalty and protective instinct that Cadet Torres describes. Commander, you cannot possibly be considering legitimizing this situation, Instructor Garrett protested. The creature is albino. The cultural stigma alone makes it unsuitable for field deployment. No unit will accept. Cultural stigma, Commander Thorne repeated coldly. 20 years ago, this academy wouldn't accept cadets from mining colonies. They said such children lacked the refinement and breeding necessary for dragon bonding. Before that, they said female cadets were too emotional. Before that, they excluded anyone who didn't come from military families. We've spent decades proving that prejudice is not the same as wisdom, Garrett. Perhaps it's time we applied that lesson to our creatures as well. She returned to her desk and accessed her datapad, scrolling through information with practiced efficiency. I've reviewed the medical reports on the dragon designated as Specimen 47W. Dr. Yena's recent examinations show remarkable improvement in all health markers. Bone density increasing, muscle mass developing at accelerated rates, scale condition rated as excellent. The creature has gained 12 kilograms in 3 weeks. His wing strength has increased by 40%. These are not the results of a defective specimen. These are the results of proper care that should have been provided from the beginning. Reyna's heart began to beat faster with something that felt dangerously like hope. Commander Thorne looked directly at her, and for the first time, there was something approaching warmth in those stern eyes. However, the commander continued, regulations exist for safety reasons. If I'm to approve this bond officially, I need to see proof that it's genuine and functional. Tomorrow morning, you and the dragon will undergo standard bonding assessment tests. You'll demonstrate communication, cooperation, and mutual trust under controlled conditions. If you pass, I'll authorize the bond formally. If you fail. She let the implication hang in the air. And if I refuse to waste academy time on this farce? Instructor Garrett said stiffly. Then I'll conduct the assessment myself, Commander Thorne replied with finality that brooked no argument. She looked at Reyna again. This is your chance, Cadet Torres. One chance to prove that kindness and intuition matter as much as tradition and protocol. Don't disappoint me. I won't, ma'am, Reyna said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. We won't. That evening, Reyna ran to Ember's pen with news she could barely contain. The white dragon stood as she approached, sensing her excitement before she even reached the barrier. She practically tumbled through the entry gate in her haste. Ember, we have a chance, she said breathlessly, throwing her arms around his neck. A real chance to make this official. We just have to show them what we already know, that we belong together. Ember rumbled deep in his chest, the sound vibrating through Reyna's whole body. He understood the emotion even if not the specific words. He nuzzled against her hair, his breath warm and steady. Over the past weeks, they had developed their own language of gestures and sounds, a communication that went beyond verbal commands into something more intuitive and profound. Reyna pulled back to look into his pale eyes, eyes that no longer looked hollow or defeated but burned with inner fire. I know you've never been trained. I know you don't know the formal commands or standard protocols. But we don't need all that, do we? We just need to trust each other. Can you do that? Can you trust me tomorrow when everything depends on it? Ember lowered his head until his forehead pressed against hers, a gesture of complete faith and acceptance. In that moment, Reyna felt something extraordinary happen. It was as if invisible threads wove between them, connecting heart to heart, mind to mind. She could sense his emotions, determination, gratitude, fierce protective love. And she knew, somehow, that he could sense hers too. We're already bonded, she whispered in wonder. We've been bonded for weeks. Tomorrow we're just showing everyone else what we already know. They stayed like that as darkness fell over the academy, girl and dragon intertwined in perfect understanding. Around them, other cadets led their creatures to comfortable sleeping quarters, to warm beds and secure futures. But none of those bonds, however formally recognized, burned quite as bright as the connection forming in this forgotten corner of the creature yards. Tomorrow would bring tests and judgment, skepticism and scrutiny. Tomorrow they would have to prove themselves worthy by standards designed to exclude them. But tonight, they had each other and the absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious. They had found belonging in a world that said they would never belong. They had found strength in each other when everyone said they were too weak to matter. And that truth, that simple and profound truth, would be enough to change not just their own futures, but the future of everyone who came after them. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one small act of kindness, one person seeing worth where everyone else saw worthlessness, one bond that refused to break no matter how much the world insisted it should. Ember and Reyna had planted seeds that night that would grow into something beautiful and strong. Tomorrow, they would show the world what those seeds had become.